Good day, retro gaming fans, and welcome to Rehab Gaming. So in this episode, we're going to take an original Sony PlayStation 1 controller and do a complete breakdown, and we'll show you all of the steps in order to get every single component out of this controller. So stay tuned, and we'll get right at it. Alright, so if anyone remembers, these are the controllers for the PlayStation 1 before the DualShock controllers came out. This is what we had when the PlayStation 1 was released, and these are still fairly desirable for games that don't require the DualShocks, but most of the collectors out there just collect the DualShock controllers because you can kill two birds with one stone. So in order to get these apart, on the backhand side of the main controller body, there is a total of 8 screws. These screws are held in with a little bit of tension from the factory. It's a little difficult to kind of break them loose after all of this time. So what I would recommend is use the proper smaller Phillips head screwdriver. And I'm going to use this size. It doesn't appear that this one actually has the size of it on there. But we're going to use this driver here. If you have a small fine tip Phillips screwdriver, just make sure that the screwdriver fits very tightly inside the screw head so you don't strip them out, and make sure you put a little pressure on the back of the head in order to get the proper torque on it. And once you hear that snap, then you're home free. So we're going to go ahead and take all 8 of these screws out and get this outer shell completely disassembled off of the interior. One more thing I wanted to mention before we go ahead and break down this controller. It is possible to get this gray outer casing of your plug off of the plug. There are 2 clips on the top side and 2 clips on the bottom side, but as you can tell right here, this sticker actually goes across that seam. So that's going to be something you're going to have to contend with, either with a sharp hobby knife or something like that. Just kind of trim that sticker back a little bit, that way you can access it, or you can peel it back with a razor blade, that way it's not getting in your way. Now that we got all the screws out of the back of the controller, we're going to go ahead and lift off this back half of the shell. So I do want to mention that with these controllers, you'll run into the bottom buttons being screwed in, and there's this little retainer clip over here that holds them in. If you want to take these out to clean them really well, you got to remove those screws and they just come right out. So just to show you, I went ahead and removed the screw. I'm going to take my tweezers. You don't need to necessarily use tweezers, but this piece right here comes right out. Then the button will press in and it will completely come out of the bottom half of this controller shell. So we're looking here at the main board and the top half of the controller, and in order to get the main board out, you got to take out the cabling right here, lift it out of the posts. Then these 2 trigger buttons come up, and just so you know, these buttons lift right out so you can pull them out. Actually, those buttons don't want to lift out. Feels like there's a clip in here that keeps these buttons in place. So in order to get these buttons out, you'd probably need to take a flathead screwdriver and put it down in here. So let's go ahead and grab our fine tip flathead screwdriver and see if we can get that tension off the button. And sure enough, there it is, pulled right out. And this is the clip that's actually holding it inside of this piece right here. In order to get it back in, just make sure you line it up right. Make sure that clip goes in this little groove right here. Push the button straight down and it goes back into place. So we're going to go ahead and lift the main board out of the controller, set it off to the side, and we'll work with our buttons. And it actually looks like our button pads for the directional side of the controller actually came off with our main board. So again, that is a good example of when you're pulling these controllers apart, if they haven't been taken apart ever, there's a good possibility that your contact pads are going to stick to your main board when you lift your main board off. And we're going to go ahead and remove the rest of the contact pads. This is going to be for your 4 action buttons: the square, the X, the triangle, and the circle. And then this is going to be your start and select button. It's its own rubber self-contained piece that has the contacts on the backhand side, so there's no plastic buttons in there. Now with the directional pad, there is this cross piece. It looks like an X. This is very important. This is actually to help stabilize the directional pad while you're pressing down on it, and it actually relieves a lot of the stress, and a lot of that stress will go to the center of the board through this hole right there. So basically, instead of all of the pressure going to the contacts themselves, the pressure on the center gets distributed to the board, which is reinforced on the backhand side of the controller shell right here. Oh, excuse me, that's the action button side, but same basic principle. It's reinforced right here, so you're not putting too much stress on the main board and risking cracking or breaking that main circuit board. We'll go ahead and lift out the directional buttons, and we'll lift out the action buttons. So with the action buttons, they actually have little tabs here, just like the PlayStation 2 controllers and the DualShock controllers. They will guide you into which specific hole they're supposed to go into. If they don't fit, that button doesn't go there. So if you really are concerned about remembering where each button goes, just take a picture of your controller shell like it is right there before you pull the buttons out. That way you can see the color coding and you know exactly where those buttons are supposed to go. So we'll go ahead and dump the rest of these out. And once you get all that dumped out, you can take your plastic shell halves and set them off to the side. If you plan on cleaning those, warm water and a little bit of dish soap does a fantastic job of getting all the gunk out of there. And also soak the plastic buttons, but do not soak these contact pads here. So we'll set all this off to the side. You can also soak this. It's not necessarily needed because a lot of the dirt doesn't get back behind to this piece, but just set this off to the side. Just make sure you don't lose it, because when I actually soak my pieces, I tend to not put that in the container, because the container I use actually has a lid, and I agitate it by shaking it back and forth, just try and break up all the gunk there. So we got the main controller board back here on our workspace, and we're going to look at taking this plastic casing completely off of the trigger button assembly itself. So in order to do that, we'll go ahead and remove this top button, set it off to the side, and then you'll notice that the rubber membrane contacts are behind this plastic piece. This was a great design because when you're putting them together, you don't have to worry about fitment or anything like that. Everything just slides in together very nicely. The PlayStation 2 controllers unfortunately don't have this piece, so the rubber contact pads sit on top of a couple of posts, then the buttons get put into the bottom side of the controller for the triggers, and then you have to try and move everything around to make sure it fits properly so you can get the controller back together. But in order to get these gray plastic pieces off, there are a couple of tabs right here that go through to the back of the board, and I'm just going to use a fine tip pair of pliers, squeezing them together, and this board just lifted up like that with the pressure of this cable right here kind of lifting up on this side. And then you can completely remove the board from the assembly, and you can get to the rubber contacts on the backhand side, and then you can also get to the contact pads right here on the trigger board. So just remember, with the trigger board, you have kind of like this T-shaped. It is impossible to get these put together the wrong way. Just go ahead and reverse the process. What I like to do in order to make sure that I'm not stressing the board too much is I put one finger on each side of this clip, push down with even pressure until it clicks back into place like it just did. Now we'll just put this trigger button back into place. I'm gonna make sure I'm putting in the right way. And After you get everything all cleaned up, you can go ahead and put your controller back together. Now, if you do have issues with your cable splitting right here, if you have to repair that, this connector right here is soldered to the board and it does not lift up. The pins that are soldered to the board are actually crimped to each individual wire here. So if you do need to repair this, what I would normally do is use the method similar to what we did in our Super Nintendo controller, where you just kind of tuck a little more of the cable inside the controller housing itself so you can bypass the area where you have the split. Or if you really want to do it all the way out and do it the right way, some people would say, you can go ahead and desolder this, get some new crimped on terminals for this, but you would actually need a terminal remover tool. I actually have a set of those right here, and they kind of look like this. So they look like keys. They'll go down inside this terminal connector. You find the right size that you need. It releases all of those clips for each individual connector and allows you to pull those pins out of that plastic connector. Then you can crimp on some new pins and put them back inside this white plastic connector housing and then resolder that to the board. So putting the controller back together is the reverse process that we used in order to take it apart. Just take your individual parts, put them back in, make sure that this piece right here is put exactly in like that, like across, and it fits over into that area. Then you take your buttons and you put them back into place. And if they don't go in and they don't drop down in there, just remember that you have the other option of transferring it to another hole, and it'll drop right in the right hole as soon as you get it rotated around. And I've taken enough of these controllers apart, so I'm fairly experienced and I can actually remember where each of the buttons go. So sometimes, every once in a while, when I'm not paying attention or if I'm kind of tired, I do put one of the buttons in the wrong place, but it's not that big of a deal. So we'll go ahead and take our rubber contact pads, place them back in there. Make sure they seat down by lifting the controller up off of your work surface. And then the top front of the controller casing is ready to have the main board dropped right back in. So remember, when you're putting your main board for the controller back in, you line up all of these posts like you see here, then your main board just kind of drop down in there. You'll have to take these trigger assemblies and make sure that you line up this little tab right here with this thin groove. So there's one of those on each side and it just slides right down in there. And then make sure that your cable on the side goes into the little cable pin retainers right there. And then we'll do the same with the other side. Make sure it slides down in and it's aligned. And make sure the cable gets right there. And make sure you avoid these two screw posts. And everything goes back together like so. Now with your cable, it gets routed around between these two, goes around between these two, and then goes out of the controller. So thankfully, the cable's memory will actually guide you through this process. And that's the way it should look coming out of the front of the controller. So we'll go ahead and take our back half of the controller. I like to have it like this when I'm sandwiching it back together because it keeps these buttons right here that are in the back side of the controller down so they don't bind up on the posts. And we'll go ahead and slide those in like so, turn it over, pop it down, and then make sure that you don't have any of the gaps or anything like that on the outside circumference of your controller, and it's ready to be screwed back together. So just as a tip, when I'm putting these back together, in order to make sure that it gets even pressure from putting the screws in, I like to put these two screws in first, and then get them to right before you need to tighten them down to where they're set into place. Then you put in these 2 screws here, and then you go in either circular fashion, you can go the crossways, it doesn't matter, but just making sure that you get even tension on your controller halves with those screws. That way you can get everything else seated back in and put back together properly. And then once you get all of the screws in, just go over each individual screw one more time with a little bit of torque, just to make sure that you don't have anything misaligned or that one of your screws are a little loose after everything has settled down. One more tip while you're screwing your controller back together, especially with how tight these screws fit into the shells, you're going to want to rotate your screwdriver counterclockwise until the threads of your screw actually drop into the threads of the post like it did right there, and then send it home. If you feel any resistance whatsoever, you're actually driving the screw into the plastic post and cutting new threads. And the reason why this can be a problem is one of 2 ways. One, it is extremely hard to get the screw in there, so you can end up stripping out the screw head. And 2, you can actually damage the threads inside of that plastic, and once they get to the point where they are damaged beyond actually being able to be held in place, the screw will be stripped out, so that hole will no longer hold that screw in there. And then 3, especially with Nintendo 64 controllers, the Funtastic Clear style ones, those controllers have really brittle plastic, and over time the plastic becomes so brittle that if you do cross thread screws in those controllers, it will completely snap the screw post underneath. So that is another risk that you can run into with these. Specifically for the Nintendo controllers, they have the posts that mount down to the front half of the shell, and those will break where the posts meet that face of the shell, and it'll just spin inside your controller. Alright, so we finally got all those screws in there, and also when you're screwing them back in, you know how they were extremely difficult to pull out and you have to put a little bit of pressure in here. Well, you got to do the same thing when you're trying to screw those screws back in. Just set the controller down on your tabletop and then put your screwdriver in here, set your hand down on top of your screwdriver, and put a little bit of pressure on there. Now it's going to feel like you're putting a little too much pressure on there. That's why I like having this silicone mat. It cushions everything. But as long as you don't put too much pressure on there to snap that post, you'll be perfectly fine. So I did say that we were going to go over how to take off this outer shell of your connector. And the main reason you'd want to do this is if you get a small little break right here and you want to kind of scoop the cable into the connector a little more. That would be your main reason for getting this off. Anyways, other than that, there's no other reason that you need to get this off of your controller. So, like I stated before, there are a couple of clips that are down in there that need to be disengaged in order to get this off. So with this terminal removal tool, I actually have a lot of flat pin tools, kind of like this. This one actually has a little spike on it. We won't be using that one. Let's get another one that would be a good, there we go. Something like that. Just a flat little piece of metal that we can use to get the clips lifted up. And then as soon as we get the clips disengaged, this whole thing will slide off. Now, I won't be recording this section of it because it is extremely tedious, I guess you would say, and it takes a little while and some finagling. And if you're kind of the person that gets a little frustrated at something when it doesn't go your way and you let out a couple of cuss words, this is going to be that project, taking this off, that's going to make you say a few choice words. So we're going to come back as soon as I get this taken off of here, and I'll show you where those clips are on this plastic piece right here for the connector, and I'll show you everything inside of that connector. So we'll be right back. Alright, so it took us a little bit, but I finally got it done. As you can see, look at the front of this connector cover here. You unfortunately do have to put a little bit of a divot because of how close these seams sit together. The plastic is going to get damaged if you ever have to take this cover off, so be mindful of that. There is no way to get this thing that I'm aware of apart without doing a little bit of scarring and some damage because of how close that these pieces sit together. So this is one of the clips that I was talking about that you need to get disengaged. So what I did was I took my flathead screwdriver, etched out a little notch right here. As you can tell, here's that little notch, and I lifted it up and took a couple of my pin keys and stuck them up under here and worked them over those latches so the latches aren't into this casing where they snap into place. And the same thing on the bottom. And that's it. That's exactly everything you need to know to completely break down a Sony PlayStation 1 original controller without the DualShock sticks. Now, you can use some of these tricks in order to take apart the DualShock controllers. They'll be designed just a little bit differently, but the insides are going to be primarily the same. And also with the Sony PS2 controllers, they really didn't change the DualShock design too much as they progressed from the PS1, PS2 to PS3 and PS4. Obviously, PS3 and PS4 had the wireless controllers, so that is one of the differences. And then also the components on the inside are going to be a little different, but the way that the buttons are secured on the inside are going to kind of be the same. The triggers on the Sony PS2 were bigger on the bottom side for the number 2 buttons, so that's another big difference. Other than that, that's all. So thank you for joining us while we tore this apart, broke it down, and got it completely put back together. If you did enjoy the video, please like, share, and subscribe. So without further ado, thanks for stopping by, and we hope you have a wonderful day.